The first sensation was fabric, a fine, cool weave against his cheek, impossibly smooth, smelling of nothing, not of soap, not of dust, not of skin. It was the scent of absence, a sterile void that clung to the air like a shroud. He breathed it in, and the emptiness filled his lungs, a hollow echo in the chamber of his chest. His body was a foreign country, a landscape of unfamiliar aches and a profound, bone-deep weariness that felt ancient. He did not move. To move was to confirm the reality of the sheets, the room, the silence. The silence was the second thing he noticed. It was not a natural quiet, not the gentle hush of a sleeping world, but a manufactured stillness, the low, sub-audible hum of environmental controls and dormant technology. It pressed in on him, a weight on his eardrums. Light filtered through his closed eyelids, a pale, uniform luminescence without a source, without warmth. He was adrift in a sea of sensory deprivation, and panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his consciousness. He forced his eyes open. The ceiling was a seamless expanse of white, the same sterile white as the light it diffused. He turned his head, the movement a slow, deliberate act of rebellion against the inertia that held him. The room was vast, minimalist, a study in grayscale geometry. A wall of polarized glass looked out onto a city of impossible height and structure, its spires piercing a perpetually overcast sky. There were no personal effects, no clutter, no life. It was a showroom, a gallery, a tomb. He sat up. The sheet pooled around his waist, and he saw that he was wearing a simple tunic of the same gray as the walls. And then he felt it, a dull, throbbing ache on the left side of his neck, just below the jaw. It was a tender, insistent pulse that seemed to beat in time with the hum of the room. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling, and traced the source of the pain. The skin was raised, ridged, a pattern of hardened tissue that felt both alien and intimately a part of him. A mark. His breath hitched. The knowledge bloomed in his mind, unbidden, an instinctual horror that bypassed thought. It was a mating mark. Fresh. The panic was no longer a prickle. It was a tidal wave, hot and suffocating. He scrambled back against the headboard, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He looked at his own hands, pale and long-fingered, and did not recognize them. He looked for a reflection, a mirror, anything to give him a face, a name, an identity. There was nothing but polished chrome and dark glass that showed only a distorted, shadowy form. Who was he? How did he get here? Who did this to him? The questions were a cacophony in the silent room, a scream no one could hear. A soft chime echoed, and a section of the far wall slid open with a whisper of hydraulics. A man stepped through. He was tall, his frame lean and severe beneath a dark, impeccably tailored uniform that absorbed the light. His hair was the color of iron, cut with military precision. His face was a mask of calm neutrality, his features sharp, ascetic, as if carved from granite. He moved with an unnerving economy of motion, each step deliberate, soundless. He stopped several feet from the bed, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture one of absolute control. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, assessed him not as a person, but as a variable, a problem to be solved. And his scent, it was the scent of the room, amplified, cold, sterile, antiseptic, and ozone, with a chilling undercurrent of something ancient and unyielding, like frost on pine needles. And the alpha. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The man before him was the source of the mark, the architect of his terror. The bond, a phantom limb he hadn't known he possessed, flared to life, a thin, taut wire connecting his panic to the alpha's unnerving calm. It was a violation, an invasion of his very soul. He could feel the placid surface of the man's emotions, a deep, still lake with unfathomable depths. "You are awake," the alpha stated. It was not a question. His voice was a low baritone, as measured and devoid of inflection as the rest of him. Elian, the name surfaced from the void, a single, solitary piece of driftwood in an ocean of amnesia, pressed himself further into the headboard, a futile attempt to escape the invisible tether that bound them. He tried to speak, to demand, to scream, but his throat was tight with a fear so profound it stole his voice. All that escaped was a choked, rasping sound. The alpha's gaze didn't waver. There was no pity in it, no malice, only a distant, analytical focus. "Your physiological signs are stabilizing. The mnemonic trauma was more severe than anticipated." Mnemonic trauma. The clinical phrase was a shard of ice in his gut. He was not a person who had been violated. He was a system that had experienced a malfunction. Who are you?" Elian managed, his voice a broken whisper. "Where am I?" The alpha took a step closer. The scent of him intensified, a clean, cold pressure that made the sensitive glands in Elian's neck ache. The bond thrummed, a painful symphony of his terror and the alpha's nothing. It was like trying to feel emotion from a statue. "I'm Director Kalen," he said, his tone unchanged. "You are in my designated residence, Sector 7, Citadel Prime." The words meant nothing. They were labels for a prison he didn't understand. Elian's hand went back to the mark on his neck, his fingers tracing the brutal, proprietary ridges. It felt like a brand, a claim of ownership seared into his flesh. "You did this," he accused, the words trembling with a nascent rage that fought against the overwhelming fear. "You marked me." For the first time, a flicker of something disturbed the calm surface of Kalen's eyes. It was not guilt. It was not regret. It was something colder, more complex. Annoyance, perhaps. The inconvenience of having to address an emotional outburst. The symbiotic bonding was a necessary measure, Kalen said, his choice of words deliberate, sterile. "It has ensured your continued viability." Viability, not safety, not life. He was not a person who had been saved. He was an asset that had been secured. The cold reality of his situation settled over him, heavier than the silence, more chilling than the alpha's scent. He was property. He was a thing. He looked at the impassive face of Director Kalen, at the unyielding lines of his uniform, at the sterile perfection of the cage he was in, and he understood. He was not just in a room. He was in a system, and the man who had marked him, the man who was now intrinsically, irrevocably tied to the very fiber of his being, was not his partner. He was his warden. The silence stretched again, but now it was filled with the terrible weight of this new understanding. His memory was a void, his identity a ghost, and his future was shackled to the cold, controlled man who watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. And through the agonizing pull of the bond, he could feel it, not an emotion, but the ghost of one, a deep, resonant hum beneath the alpha's placid control, the cold, satisfying click of a problem solved, a piece locked into place. The hours that followed bled into one another, a seamless expanse of grey time marked only by the shifting, artificial light that mimicked a day he could not see. Kalen had left him with a final, chillingly simple instruction. Rest, acclimate. Then the wall had slid shut, and the silence returned, deeper and more menacing than before. Elian remained on the bed, a statue carved from fear, until the trembling in his limbs subsided into a constant, low-grade tremor. Acclimate. The word was an absurdity. How could one acclimate to a cage? He finally forced himself to move, sliding off the high bed. His feet met a floor of dark, polished stone that was cool to the touch. The grey tunic he wore was made of a strange, synthetic silk. It was soft and weightless, the clothing of a well-kept pet. He began to explore the residence, his movements tentative, like an animal testing the boundaries of its enclosure. The space was immense, a sprawling suite of interconnected rooms that flowed into one another with a cold, architectural logic. Every surface was either polished chrome, dark stone, or frosted glass. There was art on the walls, but it was abstract and geometric, splashes of color that seemed calculated to evoke a response rather than a genuine emotion. It was the antithesis of a home. It was a statement of power, of order, of a life curated to the point of sterility. There were no photographs, no books left open, no stray objects to suggest a moment of spontaneity or carelessness. The only reflections were his own, thrown back at him from every polished surface, a pale, haunted figure with wide, dark eyes and a shock of raven hair that seemed too wild for this controlled environment. He still did not know his own face. Not really. The reflection was a stranger's, the fear in its eyes the only familiar thing. He found the kitchens, a gleaming laboratory of stainless steel where nutrient paste could be synthesized with the press of a button. He found a bathing chamber where water temperature was regulated to a precise degree and the air was infused with a neutral, cleansing vapor. He found a study lined with datapads, all of them dark and inert, locked. Every door that led to the outside was sealed, responsive only to a biometric signature he did not possess. He was a prisoner in a museum of a life, Kalen's life, and it was a life devoid of warmth, of connection, of humanity. The bond was a constant, unwelcome presence, a faint static at the back of his mind. It was a one-way street. He felt his own fear, his confusion, his despair, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that the alpha on the other end felt it too. It was the ultimate violation. His turmoil was being broadcast directly into the mind of his captor. Occasionally, he would feel a distant echo, a faint tremor along the line that connected them. It was not Kalen's emotion, not in a way he could understand. It was more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, a distant change in the weather, a flicker of intense focus, a wave of profound stillness like deep meditation, a spike of something sharp and cold that might have been anger, but was so tightly controlled it felt more like the hum of a high-voltage current. He was tethered to a machine. He was not an asset. The thought repeated in his mind, a desperate mantra. He was not an experiment. He was not a variable. But the world around him, the man who had claimed him, everything screamed otherwise. Late in the simulated day cycle, he stood before the great wall of glass, looking out at the city. It was a breathtaking, terrifying vista. Flying vehicles moved in silent, orderly streams between colossal buildings that seemed to defy gravity. The sky was a permanent twilight, the air thick with a haze that blurred the horizon. There was no sun, no moon, only the cold, artificial glow of the city itself. It was a perfect, unblinking machine, and he was a ghost, haunting one of its cogs. A memory surfaced, unbidden, a fragment, sharp and painful, a flash of light, blindingly white, the smell of ozone, much stronger than Kalen's scent, and something else, the coppery tang of fear, his own, the sound of shattering glass, a crystalline explosion, and a voice, not Kalen's, hissing a word. Defective. The fragment vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. He braced his hands against the cool glass, his breath fogging a small patch of the perfect view. Defective. What did it mean? Was that what he was? A broken thing that needed to be fixed, or declaimed, or contained? The chime sounded again, and the wall slid open. Kalen entered, holding a single covered tray. He had changed out of his uniform into a simple dark tunic similar to Elian's. Without the severe lines of the uniform, he seemed marginally less like a symbol of authority, but no less imposing. His presence filled the room, the bond flaring with a proximity that made Elian's teeth ache. Kalen placed the tray on a low table. "You have not taken sustenance," he observed, his gaze sweeping over Elian, noting the tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in his hands. "It is counterproductive to your recovery." Elian said nothing. He stared at Kalen, his defiance a fragile shield against the overwhelming power, imbalance. He would not be a compliant specimen. He would not make this easy. Kalen seemed to register his silent rebellion. He did not force the issue. Instead, he walked to the glass wall and stood beside Elian, his gaze directed out at the city. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two figures silhouetted against the cold urban glow. The bond between them was a living thing in the quiet, a thrumming wire of Elian's fear and Kalen's impenetrable control. "You are my responsibility now," Kalen said finally, his voice low, almost a murmur. The words were not meant to comfort. They were a statement of fact, a declaration of ownership. "Your previous designation has been nullified. The bond makes you mine by directorate law. Any attempt to reject it or to harm yourself will be registered as an act of destruction of official property." He turned his head, his cold eyes meeting Elian's. "My property." The word hung in the air between them, brutal and absolute. He was a thing, a possession. Kalen was not just his warden, he was his owner, and the system that had built this sterile world, this perfect city, was the one that had handed him the chain. Elian felt a surge of something hot and bitter. It was not just fear anymore. It was hatred, a pure, clean hatred for the man beside him and the world he represented. He held Kalen's gaze, letting him feel the full force of it through the bond. Let him feel the revulsion. Let him see the person he was trying to erase. For the first time, Kalen's composure seemed to fracture, just for a second. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The placid lake of his mind rippled, disturbed by the raw, untamed emotion Elian was projecting. He had found a weapon. A small one, perhaps, but it was his. He could not break the chain, but he could rattle it. And he would. He would make his owner feel every ounce of his misery, every shard of his broken identity, until the perfect, sterile world Kalen had built around them, both, began to crack. The medical assessment was scheduled for the third cycle. Kalen announced it with the same emotional detachment he used for everything, as if informing Elian of a change in the atmospheric controls. "Your baseline vitals must be recorded for the registry. You will be compliant." It was an order disguised as information. Ilian was led from the residence for the first time, not into a public corridor, but into a private transport tube that connected directly to the medical spire. The journey was silent and swift, a disorienting blur of grey tunnels and pressurized hisses. The bond was a tight, humming leash, Kalen's proximity a constant weight. The medical facility was even more sterile than Kalen's apartment. The white walls seemed to radiate a cold light, and the air smelled sharply of disinfectants and strange chemical undercurrents that made Elian's nose burn. The staff, dressed in pristine white uniforms, moved with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. They did not look at him as a person. Their eyes slid over him, cataloguing, assessing. He was an object on a conveyor belt. He was led into an examination room dominated by a single diagnostic slab, surrounded by gleaming, articulated machinery. A med-tech, an older woman with a face devoid of expression and eyes like chips of glass, directed him onto the slab with an impatient gesture. Subject designation: Omega-7 Alien Kalen, bonded, presenting with post-traumatic mnemonic dissonance. Commencing baseline scan. The words were cold, clinical. He was a label, a collection of symptoms. As the machines whirred to life, extending metallic arms with sensor arrays that hovered over his body, a wave of primal terror washed over him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, his body no longer his own. He was just a collection of data to be harvested. The medtech's voice droned on, narrating the readings into a comms unit. Respiration elevated, heart rate 110 BPM. Cortisol levels indicate extreme distress, typical for an unsanctioned bonding trauma. Unsanctioned. The word snagged in his mind. Kalen stood just inside the room, observing, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was impassive, but through the bond, Elian felt a sharp, focused attention, a current of energy directed at the proceedings. He was not relaxed. He was coiled, watchful. Elian's gaze locked with Kalen's across the room. He projected his fear, his humiliation, his hatred, pouring it all down the psychic link between them. He wanted to see a reaction, a crack in the granite facade. Kalen's expression did not change, but Elian felt a subtle shift in the alpha's inner state, a tightening of control, a deliberate walling off, as if he were reinforcing a shield against Elian's emotional onslaught. The medtech approached him with a hypospray. Sedative required to ensure accurate neurological mapping. Elian flinched back, shaking his head. "No, don't touch me." The woman's eyes narrowed in annoyance. "Non-compliance will be noted in your file, subject. It will affect your classification." "I said no," Elian repeated, his voice shaking but firm. He would not be drugged into submission. He would not surrender this last shred of control over his own body. The medtech looked to Kalen, a silent question in her gaze. It was a test of Kalen's authority over his new property. A long, tense moment passed. The hum of the machinery was the only sound. Elian's heart hammered, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He felt Kalen's focus narrow entirely onto him. It was a palpable pressure, a mental force that demanded obedience. But mixed with it, faint and deep, was something else. A flicker of what? Reluctance? Conflict? Kalen gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No sedation," he commanded, his voice quiet, but carrying an absolute authority that cut through the tension. "Proceed with the scan. Adjust parameters to compensate for the subject's distress." The medtech's lips thinned in disapproval, but she turned back to her console without another word. The authority of a director was absolute. The scan continued, the machines probing and recording, their cold sensors a constant violation. But it was a small victory, a tiny, fragile piece of his autonomy reclaimed. For the first time, he felt something from Kalen that wasn't just cold control. It was a grudging respect, buried so deep it was almost undetectable. He had defied the system, and Kalen, a pillar of that system, had allowed it. The contradiction was dizzying. Later, the point of view shifts. We are inside Kalen's mind as he stands in the observation chamber, watching Elian on the diagnostic slab. The Omega's fear is a bitter, metallic taste at the back of his throat, a constant, irritating buzz transmitted through the bond. It is an unwelcome variable in a life built on precision and control. He had anticipated the distress, but not the sheer force of the Omega's will, the defiance. It was the same quality that had drawn his attention in the first place, before the mark, before the amnesia. He accesses a secure file in his mind, a neural link to the Directorate's archives. He pulls up the Omega's previous designation, Asset 814. Status: non-compliant. Scent profile: unstable, prone to emotional variance. Recommendation: recalibration. Kalian had overseen Asset 814's final assessment. He remembered the Omega, not cowering in a sterile room, but standing in a cold, white chamber, facing a panel of evaluators. He had refused to mask his scent, a subtle, complex aroma of rain on stone and wild, untamable things. He had met their questions with a defiant silence. He was not broken, just unbroken. Wild. In a system that demanded uniformity, wildness was a terminal disease. Recalibration was a gentle word for what they did, a chemical wipe of the personality, leaving behind a placid, obedient shell, a living death. Kalen had watched, and a cold, logical calculation had formed in his mind. The Omega was a rare genetic specimen. His instability was a flaw, but his resilience was an asset. To allow him to be wiped was a waste of potential, and beneath the logic, something else, something he had not acknowledged then and refused to acknowledge now, had stirred. A primal, protective instinct, an alpha's recognition of a rare, precious thing. So he had acted. He had requisitioned the asset for a private study on scent stabilization. He had taken him to his personal lab, a place far from prying eyes. The bonding had not been a calm, calculated decision. It had been a desperate, violent act. The Omega had fought him, terrified and confused. In the struggle, a piece of equipment had shattered. The mnemonic disruptor had overloaded, its energy discharge wiping the Omega's recent memory even as Kalen's teeth sank into his neck. It was a messy, imperfect solution. It had saved the Omega's life, but had created a new, complex problem. Now, Elian was his responsibility, his secret. He felt the Omega's hatred, his fear, and it was a constant, abrasive reminder of the violation he had committed. He had saved him from one cage only to place him in another. A gilded one, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. The medtech's report flashes into his view. Bond integrity, 98.7%. Subject exhibits strong psychological resistance. Prognosis, unstable. Recommend continued observation and controlled integration. Unstable. Kalen looked at Elian, who was now sitting up on the slab, watching him with those dark, defiant eyes. Unstable was not the right word. He was resilient. And Kalen, the architect of control, found himself in the unexpected, illogical position of protecting the one thing his world was designed to destroy. A spirit that refused to be broken. The defiance, once sparked, began to smolder. Elian refused the nutrient paste, a silent, passive resistance that lasted for an entire cycle. He felt the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, the light-headedness, but it was a pain he could control, a pain he had chosen. It was a stark contrast to the unwelcome thrum of the bond and the phantom ache of the mark on his neck. He spent his time in Kalen's vast, empty residence in a state of quiet rebellion, moving through the sterile rooms not as an inhabitant, but as a ghost, leaving no trace. He would not acclimate. He would not become a part of this cold, perfect world. He was a flaw in the design, and he would remain one. Kalen observed this behavior with his usual unnerving calm. He did not force, did not command. He simply watched, his presence a silent pressure. The bond between them became a strange, tense conduit. Elian's hunger was a dull, persistent ache that transmitted through the link, a low hum of self-inflicted deprivation. Kalen, on his end, received it as a distracting, illogical signal. It was an inefficient, emotional gesture, and it irritated him on a level he could not articulate. It was chaos introduced into his ordered system. On the fifth cycle, after Elian had refused sustenance yet again, Kalen entered the main, living area where Elian was staring out at the cityscape. He did not carry a tray of nutrient paste. He held a single, small object in his hand. He stopped a few feet away, holding it out. "This is inefficient," Kalen stated, his voice flat. "Your body requires fuel. Your resistance is noted, but it serves no logical purpose." In his palm lay a piece of fruit. It was a deep, impossible red, its skin gleaming under the artificial light. It was lopsided and imperfect, a small indentation marring one side. It was the first organic, asymmetrical thing Elian had seen since waking up. The scent of it reached him, faint but real, sweet, earthy, alive. It was a stark, shocking contrast to the sterile nothingness of the apartment. Elian stared at the fruit, then at Kalen's impassive face. This was a tactic, a change in strategy, an attempt to bypass his resistance with a novel stimulus. He knew he should refuse it, that accepting it was a form of surrender. But the smell was intoxicating, a promise of a world beyond recycled air and synthesized nutrients. His stomach clenched with a painful, sharp hunger. The silence stretched, a negotiation taking place without words. Elian could feel Kalen's intent through the bond, a calm, unwavering insistence. It was not a plea. It was a command, softened into the shape of an offering. Slowly, deliberately, Elian reached out and took the fruit. Its skin was cool and slightly rough, its weight solid and real in his palm. He lifted it, inhaling the sweet fragrance. It was the scent of life, of sun and soil and rain, things he couldn't remember but felt an instinctual aching longing for. He sank his teeth into the flesh. The burst of flavor was overwhelming, a sensory explosion in the void. Sweetness and a sharp, tart tang flooded his mouth. The juice ran down his chin. It was messy, imperfect, and in that moment, it was the most real thing he had ever experienced. He ate the entire fruit, his eyes closed, focusing on the sensation, the taste, the act of nourishment. When he was done, a sticky residue on his fingers, he looked up at Kalen. The alpha was watching him, his expression unchanged, but Elian felt a subtle shift through the bond. The irritation had receded, replaced by a deep, quiet hum of satisfaction. The satisfaction of a complex machine working correctly again. Yet there was something else buried beneath it. A flicker of memory, not his own, but Kalen's, bleeding through the link. A flash of a sun, a real sun, beating down on red earth, the scent of an orchard. It was gone in an instant, a ghost of a sensation, but it left an impression. The fruit was not just a tactic, it was a memory. Kalen's memory. "Where did you get this?" Elian asked, his voice hoarse. "There are restricted agricultural zones," Kalen replied, his tone giving nothing away. "Access is limited." He had gone to some effort. This was not a synthesized flavor. It was real. The gesture was a crack in his cold, logical facade. A small one, but it was there. It was a calculated move designed to ensure his assets' compliance. But it was also an act of providing something real, something from a world that was not this one. The contradiction was a seed of confusion planted in the barren soil of Elian's hatred. That night, as the residence submerged itself in simulated darkness, another memory fragment came to him. It was triggered by the lingering sweetness on his tongue. He was in a different white room, not a medical bay, a laboratory, gleaming chrome and glass. The air hummed with the sound of machinery. He was cold, wearing a thin, paper-like tunic, and he was afraid. But there was another scent in the room, beneath the ozone and the chemicals. Pine, the scent of cold pine needles and frost. Kalen's scent. He was there. But in the memory, the scent was not a threat. It was a shield, a barrier. It was wrapped around him, a protective layer against the harsher, more frightening chemical smells of the lab. He remembered a voice, the same one from before, hissing, "Its scent profile is degrading, unstable. Recalibration is the only option." And then Kalen's voice, low and steady, cutting through the fear. "The asset is under my purview. I will conduct my own analysis, release it to my custody." The memory shattered, leaving him breathless in the dark. It made no sense. He was a prisoner, an asset, a thing. But in that memory, Kalen had not been his captor. He had been his protector. He touched the mark on his neck, the symbol of his bondage. But what if it wasn't a cage? What if it was a claim, a way of pulling him out of the fire, even if it meant branding him in the process? He thought of the fruit, the effort Kalen had taken, the flicker of a memory of a sun-drenched orchard. He thought of the medical bay, of Kalen's quiet command to refuse the sedative. Nothing was as simple as it seemed. The hatred in his heart was still there, a hard, cold stone. But around it, something new and unsettling was beginning to grow, a fragile, terrifying vine of doubt. The bond, once a source of torment, was becoming a strange new sense, an intimate window into a world he was not meant to see. With the doubt came a hesitant curiosity. Elian began to test the connection, not with waves of hatred, but with quiet focus. He would concentrate on an object in the room, a grey vase, a polished seam in the floor, and feel a distant, faint echo of Kalen's awareness, a brief, analytical note that the object was being observed. It was like feeling someone else's gaze on the back of his neck. But as the cycles passed, something else began to stir within him, a deeper, more primal change that had nothing to do with Kalen or his gilded cage. It was a low, simmering heat that started deep in his belly, a restlessness that made his skin feel too tight. His own scent, the one he could barely perceive, began to change, growing, richer, heavier, with a sweet, aching note of longing. It was the precursor to a heat, his first since the bonding. The directorate-issued suppressants he must have been on were wearing off, their effects overridden by the powerful, irrevocable chemistry of the mating mark. The approaching heat amplified everything. The sterile air of the apartment felt suffocating. The silence was a roar in his ears. And the bond became a live wire, crackling with a desperate, instinctual need he could not control. He was an Omega, and his body was crying out for its alpha. The realization was horrifying. This biological imperative, this surrender of self, was exactly what the system he hated was built upon. He fought it. He curled up on the cold stone floor of the living area, wrapping his arms around himself, trying to contain the building fire within. He focused his mind, trying to meditate, to control his breathing, to will his own biology into submission. But it was like trying to hold back the tide. He felt Kalen's return to the residence not through the sound of the door, but as a sudden, overwhelming surge through the bond. The alpha's proximity was a physical blow. His scent, cold, clean pine and ozone, was no longer just a scent. It was a relief, a promise, an anchor in the storm of his own changing chemistry. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever felt. Kalen found him on the floor, trembling, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. "Your hormonal levels are fluctuating," Kalen stated, his voice as calm as ever, but Elian could feel the change in him. The alpha's placid surface was disturbed. He was receiving Elian's distress, his need, his burgeoning heat, and his own alpha biology was responding. A low, possessive current was flowing from him, a quiet hum of instinct that vibrated along the bond. It was the first truly unguarded thing Elian had ever felt from him. "It's the heat," Elian ground out, his voice tight with shame and pain. "The suppressants. They are ineffective against a true bond," Kalen finished for him. He knelt, not close, but within Elian's personal space. The proximity was dizzying. Elian's body arched instinctively toward him, a traitorous, humiliating response. "I have supplies to manage the symptoms." Manage the symptoms. The clinical phrase was so at odds with the primal, overwhelming force coursing through him. Kalen's control was a thing of wonder and of terror. He was clearly affected. Elian could feel the rigid discipline he was exerting over his own instincts. But his voice, his posture, his actions remained perfectly measured. He retrieved a medical kit and administered a dose of fever reducer and hormone stabilizers. The cool hiss of the hypospray against his arm was a small, sharp shock of reality. It did not stop the heat, but it took the edge off the feverish delirium, clearing his head just enough to think. As Kalen worked, his movements efficient and impersonal, a scent in the medical kit snagged Elian's attention. A specific antiseptic. It was sharp, sterile, but with a unique chemical signature. And it was familiar. The scent was a key, unlocking a door in his mind. A memory, more vivid and complete than any before, flooded him. He was in the laboratory again. He was strapped to a table, not unlike the one in the medical spire. The med tech from his assessment was there, her face a cold mask. And another man, a high-ranking evaluator with a cruel twist to his lips. The evaluator was speaking. "Its pheromonal output is erratic. It fails to respond to alpha commands. It is a defective unit, Director. Recalibration is the most efficient solution. Director." He was speaking to Kalen. Kalen stood to the side, his face in shadow. His scent, the cold pine, was a thin shield around Elian. But the smell of the lab, the smell of that specific antiseptic on the medtech's gloves, was overwhelming. "I disagree." Kalen's voice was low, but it cut through the room. "The asset displays unusual resilience. Its genetic markers are too valuable for a standard wipe. I am requisitioning it for further study. The evaluator sneered. A pet project, Director? Be careful. The Directorate does not look kindly on attachments. In the memory, Elian saw Kalen step forward, his shadow falling over him. He couldn't see the Alpha's face, but he felt the sudden, intense focus of his gaze. He felt the shift in the room's atmosphere as Kalen asserted his authority. Then the memory fractured. Pain, a struggle, the sound of shattering glass, a blinding white light. Kalen's arms around him, shielding him, the sharp, piercing agony in his neck as teeth sank in, and darkness. The memory faded, leaving Elian gasping on the floor of the residence, the real world rushing back in. He looked at Kalen, who was packing away the medical kit, his face once again an impassive mask. But Elian saw him differently now. He saw the man in the memory, the man who had stood between him and the medtech's hypospray filled with whatever chemicals they used for recalibration, the man who had argued for his value, the man who had shielded him from something. The mark on his neck was not an act of random cruelty. It was not a simple claim of ownership. It was a desperate, violent, last-ditch maneuver. A move in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. Kalen had not captured him. He had stolen him. He had stolen him from the system they both served, right from under its nose. The realization was a tectonic shift, rearranging the entire landscape of his understanding. Kalen was not his warden. He was his conspirator. And this gilded cage was not a prison. It was a hiding place. The narrative lens pivots, immersing itself entirely in Kalen's consciousness. He stands by the viewport, the sprawling, illuminated geometry of the citadel stretching below him. To any observer, he is the picture of calm authority, the perfect embodiment of a directorate director. Inside, however, a low-grade storm is raging. The bond which he had forged as a tool of control and preservation has become a conduit for chaos. He can feel the Omega's heat, a low, persistent thrum of need and biological urgency that echoes within his own physiology. It requires a significant portion of his formidable mental discipline to suppress the corresponding alpha instincts, the urge to claim, to nest, to protect, to possess. It is an inefficient and unwelcome distraction. But more distracting still are the Omega's emerging memories. He feels them through the bond as sharp, painful flashes of light and shadow, echoes of a trauma he himself inflicted. He feels Elian's confusion morphing into a dangerous, fragile understanding. The neat, clean lines of their arrangement, owner and property, warden and prisoner, are blurring, and Kalen does not deal well with blurred lines. He replays the memory, not as the fragmented version Elian is experiencing, but with the cold, absolute clarity of his own recall. The laboratory, evaluator Thrax, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty, and asset 814, designated Elian, strapped to the analysis slab. Kalen had been observing the Omega for weeks. The official reason was to study its anomalous scent profile. The unofficial reason was a burgeoning, illogical fascination. The Omega was defiant. In a society engineered for compliance, it was like finding a hawk in a cage full of doves. It refused to be cowed. It met every test, every demand, with a silent, unbreakable dignity that infuriated the researchers and intrigued Kalen. He saw not a defect, but a strength that the system was too rigid to recognize. When Thrax had made the final determination for recalibration, Kalen had felt a cold, sharp certainty. It was an unacceptable outcome, a waste. To destroy such a unique specimen was an act of profound stupidity. He had intervened, pulling rank, citing the asset's genetic value. But Thrax had been suspicious. The Directorate values order above all, Director. This asset is a chaotic variable. Your interest is noted. The threat was clear. Kalen's own position was not unassailable. His unorthodox methods had already earned him scrutiny. Harboring a defective Omega would be seen as a sign of weakness, of sentimentality. He needed a permanent, unbreakable solution, a way to remove the Omega from the system's ledger entirely. The Directorate's most sacred law was the sanctity of a true bond. Once an alpha marked an Omega, the Omega was considered the alpha's exclusive property, outside the jurisdiction of asset management. It was a loophole, a relic from an older time, but it was ironclad. The decision was made in a microsecond of pure, cold logic. But the execution was anything but. He had cleared the lab, citing the need for a private analysis. He had released the Omega from its restraints. The boy, he was so young, had looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. Kalen had tried to explain, but there was no time. An alert had chimed. Thrax was returning. Panic, an emotion Kalen had not felt in decades, had flickered within him. He had moved to mark the Omega, to forge the bond that would protect him. But Elian had fought back, a wild, cornered animal. He didn't understand. He saw only another threat, another violation. In the struggle, they had stumbled against a rack of equipment. The mnemonic disruptor, a device used for wiping the memories of decommissioned synths, had been activated. It had shattered, bathing the room in a blinding flash of white light and discharging its energy field. Kalen had shielded the Omega with his body, taking the brunt of the electrical discharge, but the psychic backlash had been immense. As his teeth pierced the soft skin of the Omega's neck, sealing the bond, he felt Elian's consciousness fracture, his recent memories wiped clean by the disruptor's wave. It was a disaster, a success and a disaster intertwined. He had saved Elian's life, but he had shattered his mind. He had pulled him from the system's grasp, but at the cost of his identity. Now he is left with the consequences, a bonded Omega who hates him, who is slowly piecing together a truth that is as damning as it is liberating, and the ever-watchful eye of the Directorate. His comms unit chimes softly, a secure, encrypted channel. A message appears in his vision, projected by his neural interface. It is from one of his few trusted subordinates. Inquiry logged. Evaluator Thrax has requested access to all files pertaining to former asset 814. He is citing a security review. The cold fist of certainty clenches in Kalen's gut. Thrax is not just suspicious, he is hunting. He knows something is amiss. He is pulling at the thread, and eventually it will lead him here, to this residence, to the living, breathing evidence of Kalen's transgression. Kalen looks across the room at Elian. The Omega has fallen into a restless, fever-induced sleep. Even in unconsciousness, his brow is furrowed, his body tense. The bond between them is a low, mournful hum, a constant broadcast of pain and confusion. Kalen feels a flicker of an emotion he cannot name, an emotion that has no place in his world of logic and control. It is a fierce, burning protectiveness that goes beyond the logical preservation of an asset. He had told himself this was a calculated risk to secure a valuable specimen, a strategic move. But now, looking at the vulnerable Omega, he is forced to confront a more complex truth. His decision had not been entirely logical. It had been driven by an instinct he had long thought suppressed. an instinct that recognized not an asset, but a mate he had saved by breaking him. He was not a rebel. He was not a savior. He was a man who had broken every rule he had built his life on, for a reason he was not yet willing to admit to himself. And now, the system he had manipulated was coming to collect its due. The time for hiding was running out. The air in the apartment grew thick with unspoken words. The revelation of the memory, coupled with the fever of his ongoing heat, left Elian in a state of fragile, suspended reality. He was no longer a prisoner in the simple sense. He was a fugitive, hiding in plain sight, and his warden was his only ally. The dynamic between them shifted, the hard lines of hatred softening into a complex, wary truce. He no longer fought Kalen with overt defiance, but with a barrage of silent, pointed questions transmitted through the bond. Why? Why me? What happens now? Kalen, for his part, remained an enigma. He answered none of the questions, his mind a fortress of controlled silence. But his actions spoke of a new, heightened vigilance. He spent more time in the residence, his presence a constant, watchful shield. The security protocols on the apartment were intensified, the low hum of the defense systems now a more discernible thrum in the walls. They existed in a strange, domestic bubble of immense tension. Kalen would work on a datapad in his study, and Elian would sit in the main living area, the bond a silent conversation, a current of shared anxiety flowing between the two rooms. Elian's heat was a constant, smouldering fire, his body aching with a need that his mind now understood was not just biology, but a byproduct of the violent, desperate act that had saved his life. He felt a strange, bifurcated desire. His body craved the alpha's touch to soothe the fire, while his mind recoiled from the man who had been forced to violate him to protect him. One evening, he found he could not bear the silence any longer. He walked to the doorway of Kalen's study. The alpha was seated at his desk, bathed in the cool blue light of a holographic interface. He did not look up, but Elian knew he was aware of his presence. "You could have let them wipe me," Elian said, his voice quiet but steady. "It would have been simpler, safer for you." Kalen's fingers stilled on the interface. He slowly raised his head, his grey eyes meeting Elian's across the space. The faint light carved his face into sharp angles of shadow and light. "The recalibration process is inefficient," Kalen said, his voice a low baritone. "It destroys potential. It is a flawed solution for a flawed diagnosis." "Defective," Elian supplied, the word tasting like poison. Kalen's gaze was unwavering. "The Directorate confuses non-compliance with defectiveness. It is a fundamental error in their logic." It was the closest he had ever come to an open admission of dissent. He was not just protecting Elian, he was defying the core philosophy of the system he served. "Why me?" Elian pressed, taking a step into the room. There must have been others. Other, non-compliant assets. Kalen looked away, his attention returning to the holographic display, though he was not reading it. He was looking through it. "Your resilience metrics were anomalous." It was a clinical, detached answer, but for the first time, Elian felt it was a lie, or rather, a half-truth. A carefully constructed wall of logic to hide a messier, more human motive. "That's not the real reason," Elian said, his voice barely a whisper. The bond between them flared, and he felt a spike of something sharp from Kalen. A flash of anger, of frustration, of being seen in a way he did not want to be seen. "The reason is irrelevant," Kalen said, his voice turning cold, dismissive. "The outcome is all that matters. You are here. You are safe. That is the end of the calculation." But it wasn't. Elian knew it wasn't. The bond told him otherwise. It told him of the deep, hidden turmoil beneath the Alpha's icy control, the conflict between his programming and his instincts. He had saved Elian not because it was logical, but because some fundamental part of him could not bear to see him destroyed. It was a truth that was both terrifying and profoundly moving. The rage he had felt was gone, burned away by the heat and the slow, painful dawning of understanding. In its place was a vast, aching confusion. He was tied to a man of impossible contradictions, a high-ranking officer of a totalitarian regime who was also a rebel, a cold, calculating scientist who was governed by a fierce, protective instinct, a savior who had been forced to become a violator. He looked at Kalen, at the rigid line of his back, at the tension in his shoulders, and he saw not just his owner or his protector, but another prisoner, trapped in a cage of his own making, a cage of duty, of logic, of control. And Elian, the boy he had saved, was the chaotic variable that threatened to break the entire structure down. "You're in danger because of me," Elian stated. It wasn't a question. Kalen did not reply. He did not need to. The sudden, sharp spike of alarm Elian felt through the bond was answer enough. The fragile safety of their cage was about to be broken. The enemy arrived not with a thunderous crash, but with a polite, deferential chime at the residence's main entrance. It was a sound that had not been heard since Elian's arrival, a clear breach of their isolation. The sound sent a jolt of pure ice through Elian's veins. He was in the main living area, and he saw Kalen emerge from his study, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. But the bond screamed a different story. It was a silent, high-frequency alarm, a wave of cold, controlled readiness that was more terrifying than any outburst of anger. "Stay here," Kalen commanded, his voice low and even. "Do not speak unless I speak to you. You are my bonded Omega. You are devoted. You are content. Do you understand?" Elian nodded, his throat tight. To be compliant, to be the thing the Directorate valued. It was the only way to survive. Kalen smoothed the front of his uniform tunic, a gesture of absolute composure, and strode to the door. He placed his palm on the scanner, and the sealed entrance slid open. Standing in the corridor was a man of medium height, with thinning sandy hair and a soft, almost doughy face. He wore the immaculate white uniform of a high-level evaluator, and he smiled a gentle, unassuming smile. It was the most menacing expression Elian had ever seen. It was Evaluator Thrax. "Director Kalen," Thrax said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Forgive the intrusion. A matter of some urgency has arisen regarding security protocols in this sector. I was hoping for a moment of your time." "Of course, Evaluator," Kalen replied, his tone perfectly cordial. He stepped aside. "Please, come in." Thrax entered the residence, his pale eyes sweeping the space, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the abstract art, the polished floors, the view from the window. He was not admiring the decor. He was assessing the terrain. Then his eyes landed on Elian. The gentle smile widened. "Ah, and this must be the project you requisitioned, the one with the anomalous resilience metrics." He looked at Elian with a benign curiosity that felt like being pinned under a microscope. "Remarkable. The bond seems to have had a stabilizing effect. He looks quite healthy." Kalen moved to stand slightly in front of Elian, a subtle, protective gesture that Thrax noted with a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "My Omega's health is my primary concern," Kalen said, his voice cool, "as is the security of my residence, which your unannounced visit has just breached." Thrax gave a soft, placating laugh. "A necessary breach, I assure you. We've had a data anomaly. Records pertaining to former assets from the recalibration center have been corrupted, specifically the file for Asset 814. He paused, letting the name hang in the air like a drop of poison. "Its final disposition is unclear. The last entry notes its transfer to your custody for study, but the study's conclusion and the asset's subsequent termination was never logged. The chess match had begun. The room was thick with unspoken threats and veiled accusations. Elian stood frozen, playing his part, his eyes downcast, his posture submissive. But inside, his heart was a frantic drum. He could feel Kalen's mental state through the bond, a core of absolute cold, a razor-sharp focus, like a blade being honed. "There was no termination," Kalen said calmly. "The study yielded unexpected results. The asset's instability was not a defect, but a reaction to environmental stresses. In a controlled, stable environment, it thrived." He placed a hand on Elian's shoulder. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt through Elian's system. It was a proprietary, possessive gesture for Thrax's benefit, but it was also a silent, grounding message for him. "Stay calm. Follow my lead." The bond was an unplanned variable, Kalen continued smoothly. A moment of sympathetic response during one of its distress episodes. Unfortunate, but binding. I logged the bonding with the registry, of course. He is no longer Asset 814. He is my mate. Thrax's smile did not falter. He tilted his head, his expression one of polite skepticism. How wonderfully romantic, and how incredibly convenient. An untraceable, non-compliant asset is suddenly transformed into a director's devoted mate, all neatly tied up by a bonding that occurred behind closed doors. The Directorate values order, Kalen. This is messy. He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on Elian's neck, on the faint, silvery lines of the mark. The law is clear, of course. A bonded Omega is property, but the circumstances of this bonding are questionable. I will need to take him in for a full mnemonic scan to verify the nature of the bond, to ensure no coercion was involved. It is simply a matter of procedure. This was it, the final move. If Elian was taken, they would find the truth. They would discover the memory wipe, the cover-up. They would see Kalen's transgression. Kalen would be stripped of his rank, recalibrated himself, or worse. And Elian would be returned to the system as a defective asset, his fate sealed. Kalen's hand tightened on his shoulder. Elian could feel a surge of something he had never felt from the Alpha before. Not cold logic, not controlled instinct, but pure, unadulterated fury. A silent, arctic rage directed at the smiling man who threatened to destroy them both. "That will not be necessary," Kalen said, his voice dropping, losing its cordial edge and taking on the hard, flat tone of absolute command. "My mate is still in a fragile state of recovery. Your presence is agitating him. The procedure you speak of would cause him undue distress, and I will not permit it." Thrax's smile finally faded, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "You are refusing a direct order from an evaluator, Director? I am exercising my right as an alpha to protect my bonded mate," Kalen countered, his voice like ice. a right protected by the Directorate's oldest laws. You may question my methods, Thrax, but you will not touch him. A standoff. The air crackled with tension. Elian, the pawn in their deadly game, felt a surge of his own. He was not just a piece to be moved around the board. He was not an asset. He was not a project. He looked up, meeting Thrax's cold gaze directly. He let the man see the defiance in his eyes, the spirit Kaelan had sought to protect. Then he leaned into Kaelan's touch, a deliberate, calculated gesture of trust and affection. He reached up and placed his hand over Kaelan's on his shoulder. He let his scent, ripened by the heat, bloom into the air, a scent of rain and stone, but now laced with the unmistakable aroma of pine from his alpha. It was a clear, undeniable statement. I am his. We are one. The act caught Thrax off guard. He had expected a frightened, cowed specimen. He saw instead a united front. His eyes narrowed. He had lost this round. Very well, Director, Thrax said, his voice tight with barely concealed venom. Protect your mate. But know this. The Directorate's memory is long, and data anomalies have a way of resolving themselves, one way or another. He gave a curt, sharp nod and turned, striding out of the residence. The door slid shut behind him, plunging the room back into silence. But it was a new kind of silence, the silence of a clock ticking down to zero. The fragile safety of their cage had been shattered. The enemy knew they were here, and he would be back. The aftermath of Thrax's visit was a profound and terrifying stillness. The immediate threat was gone, but its shadow lingered, staining the sterile air of the residence. They were no longer just hiding. They were exposed. It was not a matter of if Thrax would return, but when, and with what authority. Kaelan stood motionless for a long time after the door slid shut, his hand still on Elian's shoulder. The arctic rage Elian had felt through the bond slowly subsided, replaced by a cold, grim certainty. The time for calculation and strategy was over. He will be back, Elian said, his voice barely a whisper, echoing the thought in both their minds. He won't come alone next time, Kaelan replied, his voice flat. He finally removed his hand, and the loss of contact was a sudden, sharp cold. He walked to the center of the room, his mind clearly working, processing variables, running scenarios. He will petition the High Council for a warrant to override my authority. He will cite security risks, my past insubordinations. He will build a case. And they'll grant it. Elian finished. Kaelan gave a slow, deliberate nod. Eventually, the Directorate values its hierarchy. They will move slowly, but they will move against me. We have perhaps one cycle, two at most, a deadline, an expiration date on their lives. Panic, cold and familiar, began to rise in Elian's chest, but he fought it down. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. He looked at Kaelan, who had turned to face the vast window, his silhouette a stark, lonely figure, against the backdrop of the city he was a part of, and a prisoner of. For the first time, Elian did not see a director, an alpha, or a savior. He saw a man who had made an impossible choice, and was now facing the consequences. And he had dragged Elian down with him, or saved him. The two were so intertwined, he could no longer tell them apart. "What do we do?" Elian asked. The "we" hung in the air, a new and significant weight. It was the first time he had truly aligned himself with Kaelan, an acknowledgement of their shared fate. Kaelan was silent for a moment. "There is no we," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "There is only your survival. I created this situation. I will resolve it. He turned from the window, his eyes meeting Elian's. The cold, analytical focus was back. There is a contingency plan, a service tunnel, 3 levels down. It leads to the undersectors, and from there to the old transit lines. They are mostly defunct, unmonitored. It is possible to leave the citadel, to reach the outer zones, the wastelands. His words painted a bleak picture. Escape, but to what? A life as a fugitive in a world designed to hunt and contain. And you? Elian asked. Kalen's expression was unreadable. I will create a diversion. I will corrupt my personal logs, trigger a security lockdown in this sector. It will draw their attention, buy you time. Enough time to disappear. He was going to sacrifice himself. He would face Thrax, the council, the entire weight of the directorate, to give Elian a chance to run. The cold logic of it was both perfect and monstrous. Elian was the asset to be preserved. Kalen was the acceptable loss. No, Elian said, the word coming out with a force that surprised him. I won't run and leave you to be recalibrated. Kalen's jaw tightened. This is not a negotiation. It is the only logical course of action. Your emotional response is an irrelevant variable. My emotional response is the only thing that matters, Elian shot back, stepping closer, his own anger flaring. You didn't save me because of logic. You can hide behind your calculations and your metrics, but I feel it. I feel the truth of it right here. He pressed a hand to his chest, to the center of the bond that connected them. You saved me because you couldn't let them destroy me. That wasn't logic. That was something else. And I will not let you be destroyed because of it. The bond between them crackled with the force of their conflicting emotions. Kalen's rigid, desperate insistence on his plan, and Elian's fierce, unexpected refusal to be a passive piece in it. They were at an impasse, 2 forces locked in a battle of wills. And then a new sensation bled through the link from Kalen. It was not anger or logic. It was a deep, profound wave of weariness, the exhaustion of a man who had spent a lifetime holding up a shield, only to find himself defending the one person who wanted to stand beside him in the battle. Just as Kalen was about to speak, a soft, insistent chime echoed through the residence. Not from the door. It was an internal alert. A red light began to flash on a small, discreet panel near the entryway. Kalen's head snapped toward the light, his body instantly rigid. What is it? Elian asked. It's the perimeter alarm, Kalen said, his voice dangerously low. The sub-level entry. They're not waiting for a warrant. Thrax wasn't playing by the rules anymore. He was coming now. Heavy metallic thuds echoed from below, the sound of a magnetic lock being forcibly bypassed. They had minutes, perhaps seconds. Kalen strode to a section of the wall, pressing his palm against a nearly invisible seam. The panel slid open, revealing a small cache. Inside was a compact energy pistol and a data scrambler. He took the pistol, his movements economical and precise. He was no longer just a director. He was a soldier. The plan is still the same, Kalen said, his voice hard. You run. I delay them. He tried to push the data scrambler into Elian's hands, but Elian didn't take it. He looked at the flashing red light, heard the approaching sounds of their enemy, and looked at Kalen, the man who had broken him to save him. And in that moment, he made his own choice. He was not an asset to be preserved. He was not a victim to be rescued. He was a partner in this desperate, impossible rebellion. No, Elian said, his voice ringing with a clarity and strength he didn't know he possessed. Your plan is flawed. You think like the Directorate. Logic, sacrifice, efficiency. But Thrax isn't using logic. He's using hatred. He's obsessed. And we're going to use that against him. Kalen stared at him, the pistol held loosely in his hand. What are you talking about? Elian's mind was racing, the fear and adrenaline forging a new, wild kind of clarity. He could feel Kalen's controlled readiness, but he could also feel, faintly, the approaching presence of Thrax and his enforcers, and in Thrax's mind there was a singular focus, the defective Omega, the prize. He wants me, Elian said, his eyes locking with Kalen's. He doesn't just want to follow procedure, he wants to see me broken, he wants to prove you wrong, so we'll give him what he wants. He reached out and took the data scrambler from Kalen's unresisting hand. You create your diversion, but you don't stay. You go to the escape route, and you wait for me. They will capture you, Kalen stated, the words a cold, hard fact. Yes, Elian agreed, a strange, terrifying calm settling over him. They will. And while Thrax is busy savoring his victory, gloating over his prize, I'll activate this. He held up the scrambler. And I'll use the one weapon they don't have, the one thing they can't control. He touched the mark on his neck. The bond. I'll scream down this link so loud it'll shatter every piece of unsecured tech in this room. And in the chaos, you get me out. It was a wild, desperate, insane plan. It relied on a power he barely understood and a trust that had only just been forged. Kalen looked at him, and for the first time, the mask of the director fell away completely. In his eyes, Elian saw not logic, not control, but a raw, stark fear. A fear for him. It's too great a risk, Kalen whispered. The metallic clang from below was louder now, closer. They were out of time. The greatest risk is you dying for nothing, Elian countered. He grabbed the front of Kalen's tunic, his grip surprisingly strong. Trust me, please. He poured every ounce of his conviction, his newfound strength, his desperate, fragile hope into the bond between them. He let Kalen feel his certainty. He let him feel that he was no longer the broken thing he had saved, but a person choosing to fight. Kalen's grey eyes searched his for a long, eternal second. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made, not with logic, but with trust. The heavy, magnetized door to the service corridor burst inward with a groan of tortured metal. 2 enforcers in black tactical armor stormed into the residence, their weapons raised. They were followed by Evaluator Thrax, his soft face flushed with triumph, a cruel, satisfied smirk on his lips. He found exactly what he expected to find, the defective Omega, Elian, standing alone in the center of the vast, sterile room. He was pale and trembling, the very picture of a cornered, helpless creature. Thrax's smirk widened. Well, well, he said, his voice oozing condescension. It seems the great director Kalen has abandoned his pet project. How disappointing. I was hoping for more of a fight. He gestured to his enforcers. Secure the asset and find the director. I want him in an interrogation cell before the cycle is out. The armored figures moved forward, their heavy boots silent on the polished stone floor. Elian backed away, his eyes wide with a carefully feigned terror. He held the data scrambler behind his back, his thumb hovering over the activation stud. He could feel Kalen through the bond, a distant, tense presence, moving swiftly through the lower levels as planned. He was trusting him. Now, Elian had to prove that trust was not misplaced. "Where is he?" Thrax demanded, stepping toward Elian, his gaze hungry. "Where is your brave alpha, who broke all the rules for you?" Elian said nothing, just stared at him with wide, fearful eyes, playing his part. The enforcers were almost upon him. This was it. "It doesn't matter," Thrax continued, savoring his victory. "He can't hide from the Directorate, and neither can you. I'm going to take great pleasure in overseeing your recalibration myself. We'll wipe every trace of his defiance from your mind until you are nothing but a blank, obedient little thing, just as you should have been from the start." As the first enforcer reached for him, Elian acted. He jammed his thumb down on the Scrambler's activator and simultaneously unleashed a raw, primal scream, not from his throat, but from his mind. He poured all his fear, his pain, his rage, his defiance into the psychic bond, amplifying it with the Scrambler's energy field. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A wave of pure, chaotic energy erupted from him. The lights in the residence flickered and died, plunging the room into emergency twilight. The enforcers' comms units screeched with feedback, and they staggered back, clutching their helmets. Thrax cried out, his own neural interface shorting out with a painful jolt. Every piece of unsecured technology in the room sparked and went dark. The bond, which had been a thin wire between him and Kalen, was now a roaring, white-hot conduit of power. It was agonizing, a fire in his mind, but it was working. He could feel Kalen, a sharp, sudden presence, not distant anymore. Close. The service door Kalen had used for his escape slid open. In the dim, flashing emergency lights, Kalen was a spectre of vengeance. He moved with a speed and brutality Elian had never seen. He dispatched the two disoriented enforcers in seconds, not with the energy pistol, but with a series of precise, disabling strikes. They crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Thrax, clutching his head, stared in disbelief as Kalen advanced on him. The calm, controlled director was gone. In his place was a furious, protective alpha. "You will not touch him," Kalen snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was pure instinct. He grabbed Thrax by the front of his uniform, lifting him effortlessly. The satisfaction on Thrax's face had been replaced by stark, primal fear. Elian collapsed to his knees, the psychic backlash leaving him dizzy and weak. The data scrambler fell from his nerveless fingers. The bond was still humming, a painful, high-frequency vibration, but the scream had subsided. Kalen was there, a solid, calming presence at the other end. He was safe. He was coming for him. Kalen didn't kill Thrax. It wasn't his way. He simply struck him once, a sharp, calculated blow to the temple that sent the evaluator slumping to the floor, unconscious. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the hum of the failing emergency power and Elian's ragged breaths. Kalen was at his side in an instant, kneeling, his hands hovering for a moment before gently cupping Elian's face. His grey eyes were filled with a fierce, raw emotion that Elian had never seen before. It was not just concern. It was terror and relief and a profound, wondering awe. "You did it," Kalen whispered, his voice rough. Elian leaned into his touch, exhausted but triumphant. "We did it," he corrected, a weak smile touching his lips. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a weapon. He was a partner. Kalen's expression softened, the hard lines of the director melting away to reveal the man beneath. He looked at Elian, at the defiant spirit that had upended his entire world, and he finally acknowledged the truth he had been hiding from himself. His actions had not been about logic or assets or even rebellion. They had been about this person, this Omega, his mate. Without another word, he scooped Elian into his arms, lifting him as if he weighed nothing. He carried him toward the open service hatch, toward the darkness of the tunnels, toward an uncertain future. The gilded cage was behind them, as its sterile perfection, now a scene of chaos and ruin. They were fugitives. They were traitors. They had nothing but each other and the powerful, undeniable bond that had been forged in violence and desperation and had now been reforged in trust and defiance. As Kalen stepped into the darkness of the tunnel, Elian rested his head against his shoulder. He was exhausted, his mind aching, but for the first time since he had woken up in that sterile room, he felt something akin to peace. He was no longer a ghost with no past. He was a person with a future he had chosen to fight for. And he was not alone.